Hey everyone, it's Peabody, DJ and producer and startup guy. I've been watching the news about the Push 3, as I'm sure many of you have, and I just wanted to give my thoughts on it. This is a review, but not a real review since I don't have a Push 3 and won't be buying one. I want to say up front that this is a critical review. Most of the launch reviews from YouTubers have been very uncritical, and I think it really doesn't serve consumers well to have such excited reviews about products without taking a critical eye to the value proposition of the product. And I should say, I'm a fan of the Push. I have a Push 2 and have loved it since the day I got it. But it's always been tricky to recommend it, in my opinion, and I'll talk about why. But first, let's start with the positives. Here's what I was happy to see improved on the Push 3. MPE. This is probably the biggest change and what most people are excited about, and it is cool. I think we are entering a new era of expression on digital instruments, and it's exciting. Next for me would be better MIDI clip view navigation. I was really happy to see this. Current MIDI clip editing on the Push 2 is limited. Navigating notes is a bit wonky. You have to use the sequencer timeline, and in many cases you can't access every note, which ultimately sends you back to the mouse and keyboard when you need to edit your MIDI clips. The ability to scroll through notes using the jog wheel looks like a great solution, and yeah, this is a solid fix for me. Really glad to see that. Lastly, I want to give a shout out to the power button. The recessed power button on the Push 2 drives me crazy. I always end up pushing it with my nail and it feels terrible. So I start basically every session with the Push with this terrible feeling of using my nail to push in a button, and I would be glad to not have that anymore. With that out of the way, let's dive into the less positive. After the NAMM conference had finished with no announcements of any new MIDI controllers, I was getting ready to make a video about the Push 2 where I basically discussed how, even though I loved it, it's kind of hard to recommend to others, mainly because of the price. I think you have to compare it against devices like the Maschine. I know many people won't think that makes sense, but when you look at the experience, it really does make sense. Both offer a groovebox experience, including step sequencing and also synthesis, and a wide array of instrument packs. They're even similar in terms of controlling Ableton Live. The Maschine offered clip and scene launching and recording, as well as extensive device control in Ableton, at least up until Ableton 11 and the Maschine MK3, which inexplicably dropped support for those things. But my experience using a Maschine MK1 in Ableton 10 was very similar to how I use the Push now. The biggest difference is being able to browse and load samples and plugins from the hardware, so I think this comparison makes sense. The Maschine MK3 came in at a hefty $600 already, but the Push really pushed the envelope at $800. At the time I bought my Push, a copy of Live 11 Intro was included, a $100 value, so you could argue the price was effectively a bit closer to the Maschine at $700, but many MIDI controllers come with Live Lite and at much lower price points, so this is not too much of a value. It also didn't have a built-in audio interface like the Maschine, which honestly surprised me at that price point. And that high price point is what made it hard to recommend, because if you weren't an Ableton user, you are taking a big gamble on a DAW you may not even like. You'd be much better off getting a Mini Lab or an MK Mini, both of which come with Live Lite, to see if you like Live. So that means we are mainly talking about people that already use Ableton Live. But there are many great controller options for Live. Is it worth $800 or $1,000 now? To answer that question, I tried to think about who is this really for? My answer was primarily people who perform live professionally using Ableton Live. Someone like Rachel K. Collier, who is a successful performer and makes great use of the Push in her performances, really seems like the model of the perfect Push user. But at the same time, many successful professional performers that use Live don't use the Push. FKJ is a great example of this. He's a very active, very successful performer, mostly using Live to run his sets, but he primarily uses an Akai APC40 for the performance, mostly because of the faders, which allow you to control multiple things with one hand. I think that shows that the Push isn't the only option for serious professional performers. To a lesser extent, I might point to people who really love the hands-on, instrument-focused workflow of an all-in-one or standalone device, and who want the absolute best experience doing that with Ableton Live, which is probably still the Push. That's the category that I fall into. I'd say that breakdown of customer profiles still holds today with the Push 3, it's just even narrower now because the price is even higher. There are two versions of the Push 3. One can be used standalone without a computer, and the other is a controller that connects to the computer just like the Push 2 did. The non-standalone has been bumped up in price from $800 to $1,000. It does come with an interface now, but it doesn't have XLR inputs or phantom power, and you probably already have an interface anyway that does have those things. If the two improvements I mentioned earlier, MPE and clip editing, don't mean that much to you, then it's really hard to justify the increased cost. But the Push 2 has already been discontinued by Ableton. It doesn't appear as an option to buy on their website. If you are thinking about buying the Push 2, I would get it now immediately while it's still available. When it comes to the standalone version, I think the price point is even harder to justify. At $2,000, it would seem to be an aggressive play for those professional performers that I talked about earlier, but it honestly doesn't seem like it's ready for that. In Loopop's great review, he compared the standalone version of the Push 3 to the controller version, and there was a clear touch of lag due to the relatively underpowered Intel i3 chip that powers the standalone Push. This was clear just running the demo session that comes with Live. I can imagine a large session with lots of tracks and plug-in effects, you know, the kind of session you might use when performing live, to slow down even more, and you do not want that happening during a performance. I'm also a little concerned about the battery. Ableton says it will give you 2.5 hours of playtime, but it's clear that is a best case scenario, and reviewers have already been saying they get less than that. Again, a large session file with lots of effects seems like it would be an issue with this battery. That means you'll probably be plugging in the Push when you play live, but why did they include a battery then? I think I want to end here by kind of addressing the whole standalone value proposition in general. My experience producing music extends way back to the early days of DAWs, when standalone devices were the norm, because DAWs were limited in their functionality and computing power was still expensive enough to where you usually got a better experience on the dedicated hardware than the Dell desktop your parents bought for the family.
Oh, dude, you're getting a Dell. Easy to buy, easy to own, easy as Dell.
As computing power scaled, prices dropped, and software became a lot more functional, DAWs exploded in popularity. The reason was simple. Computers were easily upgradable, prices kept plummeting, and the scalability of software meant that a huge universe of excellent audio tools were available, sometimes more innovative than the hardware versions, usually cheaper, and often for free. The downside was that writing music with the mouse and keyboard was not always as fun or creative as using your hands to play music on piano or pads. And so MIDI controllers began to evolve to bring back some of that expressiveness to computer music creation. Eventually, companies recognized that many musicians liked the focused workflow of standalone devices and began adding more and more DAW control to their controllers to replicate that all-in-one experience.
I don't have to stare at the computer. I can stay focused on the instrument. It's an instrument.
Now that I got a machine, I've had to retire my MPC.
The value here seemed clear. We were getting the power, upgradability, and scalability of general-purpose computers, plus the wide, ever-expanding universe of software tools, but with the hands-on creativity of an instrument, whether piano or pads. The standalone Push takes us backwards in time. Underpowered, less upgradable internal processing, and a limited universe of plugins. All in the name of mobility, but MIDI controllers are already pretty portable. And while making music on the go can be fun, it's just not that practical, and $2,000 is a lot to pay for a little bit of time making music on a bus or train. Also, pulling out a $2,000 device, even a laptop, on a bus is not always a great idea depending on where you live. In summary, I'll be sticking with my Push 2, and it's disappointing the non-standalone option costs 25% more now, even though MPE is kind of cool. I think there will be a lot more MPE options coming out over the next 2 to 3 years and prices will drop, so it's not enough for me to hop on now just for that. But I'm sure it's a fantastic device because the Push 2 is a fantastic device and the 3 does everything that the Push 2 does. I just wanted to provide a bit of a different take than a lot of the reviews have been making so far to hopefully help some of you that are considering making the investment in the Push 3 make the right decision. Don't worry about subscribing. I make videos on all of my different hobbies on this channel, not just music, so the next video might not be relevant, but I do appreciate you watching this one and would love to hear if it was useful for you or just your thoughts in the comments. Thanks. Cheers.